There is a moment in every great mystery where something perfectly ordinary becomes something terrifyingly extraordinary. For most of us, that moment never comes. We wake up, we go to work, we come home. We live our lives on the surface of things, literally and figuratively, never suspecting that beneath our feet, beneath the road we drive on, beneath the city we call home, the earth is keeping its secrets. But in 1963, in a small village in central Turkey, a man broke that rule. He wasn't an archaeologist. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't even particularly curious about ancient history. He was just a man, an ordinary man, doing what ordinary men do. He was renovating his house. And when he knocked down a wall in his basement, he didn't find pipes. He didn't find old brickwork. He didn't find the remnants of a previous owner's failed DIY project. Behind that wall was another room. Not just any room. A room that led to a tunnel. And that tunnel led to another room. And that room led to another tunnel. And that tunnel went deeper. And deeper. And deeper still. Until, eventually, it dropped 280 feet into the earth. 280 feet. Let that sink in for a moment. That is deeper than a 20-story building is tall, but going down, not up. That is deeper than the foundations of most skyscrapers. That is so deep that the temperature down there never changes, summer or winter, hot year or cold year. It sits at a constant, eerie, unchanging 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Down there, the seasons don't exist. Time doesn't exist the way it does for us. The sun, that massive star 93 million miles away that runs every clock on Earth, means absolutely nothing. You could live down there for a year and you would never once feel the warmth of it on your skin. And someone did. Many someones. For a very long time. This wasn't a cave. This wasn't a tunnel dug by smugglers or a cellar carved out by a medieval peasant who needed somewhere to store his grain. This was a city. An entire, functioning, deliberately designed, architecturally sophisticated city, built entirely underground, carved directly into the volcanic rock of the Cappadocian Plateau, complete with streets and homes and schools and churches and stables and kitchens and wells and wineries and meeting halls and, most chillingly of all, everything you would need not just to survive for a few weeks but to live, genuinely live, for months. Possibly years. The name of this place is Derinkuyu. In Turkish it means simply, deep well. But that name tells you almost nothing about what this place actually is. 18 levels. Carved into the rock by human hands with tools we can barely imagine, shaped over centuries we cannot fully trace, abandoned for reasons that still make historians uncomfortable when they try to explain them. 18 levels that could comfortably house 20,000 people. 20,000 people. The entire population of a small British market town, underground, in darkness, breathing recycled air, drinking from wells that reached the aquifer, eating food they had stored and grown and preserved, and doing all of this not for a weekend camping trip, not for a few days of emergency shelter, but for extended periods. Months. In some theories, years. And here is the question that will follow you through everything we are about to discuss. Why? Why does a civilization build something like this? Why does a people invest the almost incomprehensible labor required to carve 18 floors of living space into solid rock? Why do they include schools? Why do they include wineries? Why do they include stables for their animals? Why do they design ventilation systems so sophisticated that they still function today, 2,500 years after they were first carved? Why do they build rolling stone doors, massive, circular, disc-shaped slabs of rock, some weighing over 1,000 pounds, doors that can only be opened and closed from the inside? Not from the outside. From the inside. Let me say that again because I want you to really understand what that means. The doors at Derinkuyu, the massive, immovable ton-weight doors that seal off each level from the next, can only be opened from within. A person on the outside cannot get in once those doors are closed. The entire fortress, and that is really what this is, an underground fortress, is designed around one fundamental principle. Once you go inside, you control who comes in. And nothing on the outside can force its way through. That is not the architecture of a storage facility. That is not the architecture of a wine cellar or a grain store. That is the architecture of absolute, total, desperate, sustained terror. And here is what keeps me awake at night about this place. It is not the darkness. It is not the scale. It is not even the engineering, which we will come to and which will genuinely make your jaw drop. What keeps me awake is this: those doors were used. Those ventilation shafts circulated real air for real lungs. Those wells provided real water to real people. Those kitchens cooked real food. Those schools, and yes, there are rooms down there that scholars believe were schools. Those schools taught real children. Real children. Born underground or brought underground so young they may not have remembered the surface. Children who grew up knowing nothing but rock ceilings and lamp smoke and the endless, echoing, claustrophobic dark. What must that have been like? What must it have been like to be a parent in Derinkuyu watching your child learn their lessons by the guttering light of an oil lamp, 60 meters below the surface of the earth, knowing that above you, somewhere above you in a world you could no longer safely access, something was waiting. Something so terrible, so relentless, so utterly beyond your ability to fight or flee or bargain with, that the only answer your civilization had been able to devise was this: go underground. Go deeper. Stay hidden. Wait. We are going to spend the next 2 hours trying to understand this place. We are going to examine its engineering, its defense systems, its water supply, its social structures, its psychology. We are going to look at every theory, from the mundane to the extraordinary, about what drove people down here. We are going to follow the trail of clues that archaeologists and historians and geologists have spent decades assembling. And by the end, you will understand why Derinkuyu is not just a remarkable archaeological site. It is a message, a warning, a monument carved in stone by people who faced something we cannot fully comprehend, and left behind the evidence of their response for us to find thousands of years later. They could not tell us what they were hiding from, but they could show us exactly how terrified they were. And they did. To understand Derinkuyu, you have to understand the land it was built in. Because without that land, without one very specific, the plateau stretches across central Anatolia, what we now call Turkey, at an elevation of around 3,000 feet above sea level. The climate is harsh, the winters are brutal, the summers are searingly hot. It is not obviously a place where great civilizations should flourish. But beneath the ground, it is something else entirely. About 9 to 11 million years ago, 3 volcanic mountains erupted. Erciyes, Hazandag, Guladag. They erupted not once but repeatedly over millions of years, covering the plateau in thick layers of volcanic ash and lava. That ash and lava compressed and hardened over millennia into a type of rock called tuff, or tufa, a substance that is, by the standards of rock, remarkably soft. Soft enough to be cut with a hand tool. Soft enough to be shaped with chisels made of bronze or iron. Soft enough, crucially, to be carved into rooms, tunnels, passages, and staircases without heavy machinery, without dynamite, without any of the industrial technology we associate with large-scale construction. You could, quite literally, carve a city into this rock with nothing more than a determined enough work party and enough time. And someone did. But the geology offers something even more valuable than workability. It offers concealment. From above, from the surface, from the air, if you imagine looking down from a hill or a mountain, a city carved into this rock is invisible. There is nothing to see. The landscape looks exactly like it always has. Those extraordinary fairy chimney formations, the irregular plateau, the scrubby vegetation. You could walk within 10 meters of an air shaft and never know it was there. You could ride a horse across ground that concealed 18 floors of human habitation without your horse's hooves ever betraying a hollow sound. The tuff is too thick, the rock too dense. This is important. Not just because it makes for a dramatic story, but because it tells us something about intent. The people who built Derinkuyu were not building a monument. They were not building something they wanted found or known about or admired. They were building something they wanted hidden. The landscape was not incidental. It was chosen. It was weaponized. The invisibility of Derinkuyu from above was not a happy accident. It was the point. And here is a detail that most people who know a little about Derinkuyu do not know. It is not alone. Derinkuyu is the largest and deepest of its kind, yes. But it is not the only underground city in Cappadocia. There are hundreds of underground settlements of varying sizes carved into the tuff of this region. Some are small, just a few rooms, a few tunnels, enough for one extended family perhaps. Some are much larger. The city of Kemakli, just a few miles from Derinkuyu, is almost as extensive, going 8 levels deep. And Kemakli and Derinkuyu are connected. There is a tunnel, a passage, running between them. Nearly 10 kilometers long. Wide enough for a person walking upright, but no wider. The kind of passage you would use to move people or supplies from one city to the other in secrecy, underground, without ever emerging onto the surface. 10 kilometers of tunnel. Underground. Between two underground cities. What kind of world makes that necessary? What kind of threat requires that a civilization maintain a secret underground highway between its two largest refuges, so that in the event one city is discovered, its population can relocate to the other without ever being seen? Think about the logistics of that. The engineering. The planning. This was not a panic measure. This was not dug in a hurry when the danger arrived. This was built over generations, maintained over generations as a permanent feature of the infrastructure of daily life. The threat was not occasional. The threat was permanent. And whatever it was, it required an answer of almost incomprehensible scale and sophistication. Before we go any further, there is something we need to address. When was Derinkuyu built? This is a question that has driven archaeologists to distraction for decades, and the honest answer is, we do not know with certainty. We think we know roughly when it was significantly expanded and most heavily used. We think we know some of the groups who lived there. But the deepest levels of the city, the earliest levels, remain stubbornly, frustratingly difficult to date precisely. What we do know is this. There is evidence of human habitation in the region going back to the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age, roughly 8,000 years ago. The region was home to the Hittites, one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, whose empire rivaled Egypt at its height. After the collapse of the Hittite Empire, and that collapse is a story in itself, one we will return to, the region passed through the hands of various peoples: Phrygians, Persians, Greeks, Romans. Each of these groups may have used the underground cities. Each of them may have expanded them. The Phrygians are often credited with significant early construction. The early Christians of the 1st centuries AD almost certainly used them as hiding places and later as centers of worship and refuge from Roman persecution. But who first carved the deepest tunnels? Who designed the ventilation system? Who laid out the original floor plan of those 18 levels? We genuinely do not know. And that uncertainty is itself a kind of hook. A mystery inside the mystery. Because the deepest levels of Derinkuyu feel, to many historians, older than the written records that document it. They feel as if they predate not just the civilizations we can name, but possibly some of the civilizations we know existed. Some researchers have proposed dates going back 5,000 to 6,000 years. Others go further still, though those claims remain deeply controversial. What is not controversial is that whoever first carved those deepest passages, they were not building for a short-term emergency. They were building for permanence. They were building something intended to last, and to be returned to, for generations. They were right. It lasted millennia. Let us talk about what it actually takes to build something like Derinkuyu. Because the moment you start doing the maths, the moment you start trying to picture the actual human labor involved, something shifts in your understanding of this place. It goes from being a historical curiosity to something that borders on the incomprehensible. The total volume of rock removed from the earth to create Derinkuyu is estimated at roughly 2.5 million cubic feet. 2.5 million cubic feet of volcanic tuff, carved out by hand, using bronze and iron tools, carried to the surface and disposed of, all without leaving obvious archaeological. Fathers and mothers dug rooms they might never see filled with families. The people who began this city did not live to see it completed. The people who finished it had no living memory of its beginning. That level of commitment, that willingness to pour generations of collective labor into a project whose completion you would never see, tells us something profound about the seriousness with which these people regarded the threat they were building against. They were not panicking. They were planning. But of all the engineering achievements at Derinkuyu, and there are many, none is more extraordinary than the ventilation system. Consider the problem you face. You have carved 18 floors of living space into solid rock. At the bottom level you are 280 feet below the surface. You have rooms, tunnels, passages. You have people, 20,000 people, potentially, breathing down there, cooking down there, burning oil lamps down there, keeping animals down there. Every breath they take consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. Every flame they light consumes oxygen. Every animal they house breathes and produces waste gases. Without a functional ventilation system, Derinkuyu would have been a death trap. Not from any external threat, but simply from suffocation. 20,000 people in an enclosed space without fresh air would use up the available oxygen in hours and die. The people who built Derinkuyu knew this. And they solved it. They carved 52 ventilation shafts through the rock, reaching from the deepest levels to the surface. Each shaft is carefully positioned, carefully angled, carefully dimensioned. They are not just holes drilled straight down. They are a sophisticated network of interconnected airways that create airflow through the entire structure, drawing fresh air down and stale air out through the principles of convection. And here is the extraordinary part. Today, right now, in the 21st century, after 2,500 years of disuse, after earthquakes, after Ottoman conquests, after everything that time and history and geology have thrown at this region, the ventilation system at Derinkuyu still works. You can stand at the bottom of the deepest accessible level, in a room carved into the rock 2.5 millennia ago, and feel fresh air moving past you. Cool, clean, breathable air drawn down through shafts designed by engineers whose names we do not know, using techniques we are still working to fully understand. That is not maintenance. That is not luck. That is genius. That is a ventilation system so precisely engineered that it has required no repairs, no maintenance, no human intervention whatsoever, and it still functions perfectly. I want you to think about that the next time you call someone to fix your central heating. But the ventilation shafts had a second purpose. A crucial second purpose that reveals, again, just how carefully and completely the builders of Derinkuyu had thought through every possible scenario. The shafts also served as wells. Not all of them, but many. They were designed to reach the water table, the underground aquifer that sits beneath the Cappadocian plateau, and to provide clean, fresh, uncontaminated drinking water to the people sheltering below. Uncontaminated. That word is important. If you are besieged, if an army has surrounded your position and is trying to force you to surrender, one of the oldest and most effective tactics is to poison the water supply. Cut off a city from its water and it will fall in days. Poison its wells and the survivors will be too sick to fight. The builders of Derinkuyu thought about this. The wells at Derinkuyu do not rely on any surface water source. They go directly to the aquifer. An enemy on the surface cannot poison them, cannot block them, cannot contaminate them. The water source is unreachable from above. Furthermore, and this is a detail that I find almost beautiful in its ruthlessness, the wells at each level are sealed from the levels above and below. Each level has its own water access, but those water channels are isolated. This means that if, in a worst-case scenario, an enemy somehow managed to get inside and contaminate the water at one level, the contamination could not spread to the other levels. This is quarantine thinking applied to water safety. This is the kind of thinking that says, I have imagined every possible way this could go wrong, and I have designed a solution for every one of them. This is not the thinking of someone who built this in a panic. This is the thinking of someone who had time, years, decades, generations, to think through every scenario. Someone who understood siege warfare, understood disease transmission, understood the psychology of prolonged confinement. Someone who built this to last. Let me tell you something about the water that goes beyond military strategy. 280 feet underground in a city of 20,000 people, water is not just survival. Water is sanitation. Water is hygiene. Water is the difference between a functional community and a catastrophic outbreak of disease. The builders of Derinkuyu understood this too. The drainage system at Derinkuyu, the way wastewater and sewage were managed, shows evidence of careful planning. Waste disposal channels are separated from fresh water supplies. The layout of the city reflects an understanding that human waste, if it contaminates the water supply or accumulates in confined spaces, will kill more people than any enemy. Think about what we know from history about medieval cities. Above-ground cities with fresh air and open spaces, and how frequently and catastrophically they were swept by disease. The Black Death, the repeated outbreaks of cholera, the epidemic cycles that killed 1 in 3, 1 in 4 of urban populations. Now imagine those same disease dynamics in a sealed underground space. No sunlight to kill pathogens. Limited ability to isolate the sick. Recycled air. Confined quarters. The people of Derinkuyu were not medieval Europeans stumbling through their understanding of germ theory. But they had the observational intelligence to understand that dirty water kills, that waste near food kills, that sick people near healthy people kills. They built those understandings into the architecture. The fact that 20,000 people could survive extended periods underground without the kind of catastrophic epidemic that would have wiped them out suggests those systems worked. Let me walk you through Derinkuyu. Let me take you down level by level and show you what is there. Because reading about it is one thing. But when you start to understand the actual layout, when you begin to grasp the spatial complexity of what was built here, something changes. The abstraction becomes concrete. The numbers become rooms. The rooms become lives. You enter through one of the surface entrances. In ancient times, these must come in single file, crouching, unable to use weapons effectively, unable to turn around quickly, unable to bring the weight of numbers to bear. A single defender at the far end of that passage, with a spear or even a large stone, can hold off 10 attackers. 50 attackers. 100. The entrance is not just a door. It is a killing corridor. As you go deeper, the passages widen and the rooms open up. This is where the city becomes extraordinary. On the upper levels, closer to the surface with better access to light and fresher air, you find the living quarters. Rooms of varying sizes. Some are clearly family spaces, large enough for a small group, with carved niches in the walls where oil lamps would have been placed, with smooth floors that suggest they were covered with mats or rugs. Some are larger communal spaces. The walls, in many places, still show the tool marks of the people who carved them. Each stroke of the chisel, each point of the pick, preserved in the rock for 2,500 years. You can, if you look carefully, see the direction of the strokes. You can reconstruct, in your mind, the physical motion of the person who made them. A person who has been dead for perhaps 100 generations, whose name is lost, whose face is unknown, whose life we can only barely imagine, but whose work you can touch with your fingertips. That is not history as abstract fact. That is history as physical presence. On the first and second levels there are stables. Stables. For animals. This detail, when I first encountered it, stopped me completely. Because it means something very specific. The people who used Derinkuyu did not abandon their livestock when they went underground. They brought their animals with them. Their donkeys, their goats, their cattle, the foundation of their agricultural economy, the source of their milk and meat and wool, the animals that pulled their plows, they brought all of them underground. Think about what that means in practical terms. The noise, the smell, the additional demand on the ventilation system, the additional food requirements, the additional waste management challenge. And yet they did it. Because those animals were too valuable to leave on the surface. Because their loss would have been economically catastrophic. Because a civilization that emerged from underground to find its livestock dead or stolen would struggle to rebuild. Because the people who designed Derinkuyu were thinking not just about survival during the crisis, but about recovery after it. They were planning to come back out. They were planning to rebuild. They needed their animals to do that. This is not the thinking of people who expected to die underground. This is the thinking of people who expected to survive, and to return to the world above, and to continue. There are wineries at Derinkuyu. Press rooms, fermentation vessels carved into the rock, storage area. Archaeological evidence suggests that grapes and grain were stored in sufficient quantities for extended periods of production and consumption. What? Underground. 2,500 years ago. Why does this matter? It matters because it tells us about the duration of occupancy that the builders anticipated. You do not build a winery in an emergency shelter you expect to use for a few days. You build a winery in a place you expect to inhabit for months. For years. Wine takes time to ferment. It takes equipment. It takes knowledge and skill. The presence of winemaking facilities at Derinkuyu tells us, unambiguously, that whoever designed this place expected its inhabitants to be there long enough that the full cycle of winemaking would not just be possible but worthwhile. They expected people to go underground, set up their winery, make wine, wait for it to ferment, age it, and drink it. That is an expected stay of months at minimum, possibly years. On the deepest accessible levels, archaeologists believe they have identified rooms that may have served as schools. Specifically, though this is later in the city's history during the Christian period, as rooms for religious instruction and education. A school. Underground. For children. I keep coming back to the children. If you have a school, you have children. If you have children, you have families. If you have families underground for extended periods, you are not dealing with a military garrison or a refuge for fleeing adults. You are dealing with a complete, functioning community, with all the complexity and all the heartbreak that implies. Children who were born underground, or who came underground so young they had no memory of the surface. Children who learned their lessons in rooms lit by oil lamps, with air that smelled of smoke and stone, with the constant background noise of an underground community, footsteps echoing through rock passages, voices carrying in ways that distort and unsettle, the distant sound of water. What did they dream of? What did they imagine the world above looked like? How did their parents describe it to them? The sky, the sun, the smell of rain, the feeling of wind. How do you explain grass to a child who has never seen it? How do you explain the color of the sea? How do you keep a child's mind alive and growing and hopeful in a place like this? And yet they tried. The school is evidence of that. They did not let the children's minds go to waste. They did not accept the darkness as an excuse to stop trying to build a future. That, in its own quiet way, is one of the most extraordinary things about Derinkuyu. Of everything at Derinkuyu, the scale, the ventilation, the water system, the schools, the stables, there is one element that, more than any other, makes the reality of this place hit home. The doors are what make this real. They are circular. Disc shape. Carved from a single piece of stone, each one typically between 5 and 8 feet in diameter, and between 1 and 3 feet thick. They look, at first glance, almost like giant millstones, the kind of stone used to grind grain. And in fact, that similarity may have been intentional, providing a degree of camouflage for their true purpose. They weigh on average around 1,000 pounds. Some of the larger ones considerably more. Moving one requires significant effort even with modern equipment. Moving one 2,500 years ago without power tools, without cranes, required a system of channels and pivots and almost certainly the effort of multiple people. But they could be moved. They were designed to roll, along channels carved into the rock floor, fitting precisely against carved apertures in the walls. They rolled on their curved edges, spinning into place like an enormous coin falling flat. And when they were in place, when they had been rolled across the opening they were designed to seal, they were immovable from the outside. From the outside there was nothing to grip. No handle, no lever, no mechanism of any kind. Just a curved stone surface, flush against the rock, with no gap large enough for a hand to find purchase. You could beat against it with hammers and it would not move. You could spend days trying to force a lock that used the geometry of the chamber itself as its mechanism. A lock that required nothing but a piece of wood and the strength of one person to operate. One person could lock a door that 100 men on the outside could not open. And the doors did not just seal the main entrances. They sealed individual levels. Each of the 18 levels could be isolated from the levels above and below it. You could seal off the top 3 levels while keeping the lower 15 open. You could seal off a single level that had been compromised, by disease, by a partial incursion, by any kind of emergency, and continue functioning in the levels on either side. Think about what the design of these doors tells us. It tells us that the builders of Derinkuyu anticipated a scenario in which they would need to seal a level off from another level. Not just seal the entire city from the outside world, but seal one section of the city from another section. Why would you need to do that? The obvious military answer is, because you need to be able to seal off a level that the enemy has reached, to prevent them from advancing further. If attackers manage to get through the outer defenses and into one level, you seal them in that level and let them starve, while continuing to function in the levels they cannot reach. That is a reasonable explanation. But there is another explanation. One that becomes relevant when we start to consider not invading armies but disease. If a plague broke out in one level of the city, if a contagious illness began to spread through the families in one section, you would need exactly this capability. The ability to seal off the infected level, to quarantine the sick from the healthy, to prevent the disease from spreading throughout the city. Quarantine thinking. Medieval European cities learned this lesson the hard way during the Black Death. Derinkuyu appears to have built it into its fundamental architecture thousands of years earlier. Whether the original builders were thinking about military incursions, disease outbreak, or both, the result is the same. A system of containment so flexible and robust that it could handle almost any scenario. But I want to return to something I said at the beginning because it bears closer examination. The doors at Derinkuyu don't just keep things out. They keep you in. Read that carefully. The door that can only be locked from the inside, that can only be unlocked from the inside, that an outside force cannot open. That door is, from a certain perspective, a prison door as much as a fortress door. Once those doors are closed, you are committed. You cannot open them in a moment of panic and rush out. You cannot unlock them and surrender. The community inside made a collective decision to close those doors, and that decision was, by the nature of the mechanism, irreversible until someone on the inside chose to reverse it. The person who locked the door was not just protecting the community. They were committing the community. There would be no opening those doors because someone was scared of the dark. No opening those doors because a child was crying for sunlight. No opening those doors because after 3 months underground, someone could not bear another day of rock ceilings and lamp smoke and the smell of animals and unwashed bodies. Once closed, those doors stayed closed until whoever was in charge, the elders, the leaders, the guardians of the community, decided the threat above had passed. Can you imagine living under those conditions? Can you imagine the psychological pressure of knowing that the door between you and the sky above could only be opened when the community consensus allowed it? This was not just an engineering problem the builders of Derinkuyu solved. This was a social engineering problem. The doors required a community with the discipline, the trust, and the psychological resilience to remain underground, together, in the dark for as long as it took. That is a very particular kind of society. A very particular kind of culture. What created it? What kind of history, what kind of repeated, generational trauma, shaped a people capable of doing this? The question of who built Derinkuyu is one of the most contested in Anatolian archaeology. Not because there is no evidence, but because there is evidence of multiple peoples having used, expanded, and modified it over a very long period of time. Derinkuyu, like many great ancient sites, is not the product of a single civilization or a single moment in history. It is a palimpsest, a document written over and over again, with each new group of occupants adding their layer of habitation and modification on top of what came before. But we can identify several key groups. The first serious candidate for at least the early phases of Derinkuyu's construction is the Hittites. The Hittites were one of the great powers of the ancient Near East, a civilization whose empire, at its height around 1400 to 1200 BC, stretched across most of what is now Turkey, Syria, and parts of the Levant. They were the rivals of Egypt, the authors of the world's first known peace treaty, a sophisticated culture with a complex legal system, a rich mythology, and extraordinary metalworking skills. They were also, importantly, intimately familiar with the volcanic geology of central Anatolia. Their capital, Hattusa, was built partly in and partly around volcanic rock formations. They had the geological knowledge, the tools, and arguably the engineering tradition to have begun the underground excavation of sites like Derinkuyu. Furthermore, the Hittite texts, clay tablets found at Hattusa and elsewhere, describe underground chambers and subterranean passages in contexts that suggest these were familiar, utilitarian features of their architecture. Not mysterious, not extraordinary. Just underground rooms. Part of the normal vocabulary of Hittite construction. If the Hittites began Derinkuyu, or substantially expanded an even earlier construction, they would have done so at a time when the region was under near constant military threat. The Hittite Empire was surrounded by rivals. The Mitanni to the east, the Egyptians to the south, the Assyrians, the Kaskians in the north. A refuge of this kind would have had obvious and immediate strategic value. But here is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Around 1200 BC, give or take a few decades, something happened. Something that historians call the Bronze Age collapse, and that deserves to be far better known than it is, because it is one of the most catastrophic events in the entire history of human civilization. Within the space of roughly 50 years, almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Not declined. Not weakened. Collapsed. Gone. In some cases entirely and permanently. The Hittite Empire, gone. Mycenaean Greece, gone. The palace culture of Crete, gone. Ugarit, one of the great port cities of the ancient world, gone, burned to the ground, never rebuilt. The Egyptian Empire, survived but severely weakened, never again what it had been. This was not a single military defeat. This was not a drag of large groups of displaced peoples, the so-called sea peoples, whose raids destabilized already weakened states. The Bronze Age collapse is, in the estimation of many historians, the closest analog in the ancient world to a total civilizational collapse. A genuine apocalypse. Not a metaphorical one. A real one. And it happened right here. In this region. To the people who had been building and using Derinkuyu. Put yourself in the shoes of a person living in Cappadocia around 1200 BC. Your empire, the Hittite Empire, the most powerful political entity in your known world, has just disintegrated. The cities are falling. Refugees are everywhere. Trade has collapsed. Food is scarce. Armed groups are moving across the landscape with no political authority left to constrain them. The world you knew, the ordered, structured, hierarchical world of the Hittite Empire, is gone. And in its place is chaos. Permanent, terrifying, apparently endless chaos. What do? You do what humans have always done in the face of incomprehensible catastrophe. You go underground. You close the doors. You wait for the world to sort itself out. The Bronze Age collapse is, in many historians' view, the defining event that drove the most intensive period of occupation at sites like Derinkuyu. Not the original construction, perhaps, but the most desperate and sustained use. People who had seen their empire fall, their cities burn, their trade routes collapse, their food supplies fail. People who had been through or were going through a genuine civilizational apocalypse, used these underground cities as survival bunkers, as refuges of last resort. And they stayed. For a long time. Because outside the chaos was not resolving. Outside the apocalypse continued. After the Bronze Age collapse, as the dust slowly settled over decades and centuries, new peoples moved into the vacuum left by the Hittites. The Phrygians, a people from the northwest, associated in later mythology with the legendary King Midas, moved into central Anatolia and became a dominant cultural force. They almost certainly used and expanded the underground cities. Their material culture has been found in Cappadocia. Their presence in the region is not in doubt. After the Phrygians came Greek influence, not a military conquest as such, but the spread of Hellenic culture through trade, intermarriage, and the gradual absorption of local populations into the Greek cultural sphere. Greek names appear in the region. Greek pottery and coinage. And, eventually, Greek-speaking communities who would have their own reasons to use the underground cities. The most extensively documented period of occupation at Derinkuyu comes from the early Christian era, the first several centuries AD. Early Christians in the Roman Empire had a problem. They were a minority religion in a state that regarded them at various times as subversive, antisocial, and dangerous. Roman persecution of Christians was intermittent but severe, and in the provinces of Anatolia, which had a long history of both Jewish and Greek philosophical traditions feeding into early Christianity, the underground cities of Cappadocia became places of genuine refuge. Christians used Derinkuyu as a hiding place. They used it as a place of worship. Some of the rooms at Derinkuyu were converted into chapels, and the archaeological evidence suggests these chapels were used for extended periods. There are carved crosses in the walls. There are what appear to be baptismal fonts. There are rooms arranged in configurations that suggest liturgical use. The arrangement of a church service performed underground by candlelight, in secrecy, in a rock-cut chamber 2,000 feet below the surface of a land where their religion was, at that moment, illegal. The faith that would eventually become the official religion of the Roman Empire was, in its early years, hiding underground in Cappadocia, praying in darkness, waiting for the world above to change. It did change. Eventually. But the Christians of Cappadocia, some of the same communities that produced some of the most important theological writers of early Christianity, never entirely abandoned their underground refuges. Because the Romans were not the only threat. After the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, after the persecution ended, new threats arrived. The Arab raids of the 7th and 8th centuries. The Seljuk Turks. The Mongols. Each new threat sent the people of Cappadocia back underground. Back to Derinkuyu. Back to the doors that only opened from the inside. The last well-documented period of occupation at Derinkuyu is from the early 20th century, when Cappadocian Greek communities, Orthodox Christians who had lived in the region for centuries, reportedly used the underground cities during periods of conflict. After the population exchanges following the First World War and the Turkish War of Independence, the Cappadocian Greeks were relocated to Greece. The communities that had maintained living knowledge of Derinkuyu, that had, in some cases, used it within living memory, were gone. The city was forgotten. Or rather, the surface-level knowledge of it was lost. The man who knocked down his basement wall in 1963 didn't know he was standing above a lost city. He just knew there was another room behind the wall. The city had been waiting, in darkness and in silence, for someone to come back. We have spent a lot of time on the engineering of Derinkuyu, the physical facts, the numbers, the systems. Now I want to talk about something harder to measure but perhaps more important. What happens to a human being who lives underground? Not for a day. Not for a weekend camping trip or a potholing expedition. But for months. For years. In darkness punctuated only by the uncertain, flickering light of oil lamps. In air that smells of rock and smoke and animals and unwashed bodies. In a space where you cannot stand upright in many of the passages. In a community of 20,000 people living cheek by jowl in carved rock chambers, with all the noise and conflict and claustrophobia that implies. We have some data on this. Modern research on cave dwelling, on extreme isolation, on life in confined spaces, from Antarctic research stations, from submarine crews, from space station inhabitants, gives us a partial picture. And what that picture shows is not reassuring. Start with the physical. The human body evolved under the open sky. We are, by every biological measure, creatures of the surface. Our circadian rhythm, the internal clock that regulates sleep, appetite, hormone production, immune function, is calibrated to the 24-hour cycle of light and dark. Remove the light and that clock begins to malfunction. Without sunlight, the body's production of vitamin D collapses. Vitamin D is not just a vitamin. It is a hormone precursor essential for bone health, immune function, mood regulation. The parents who brought their children underground were not being negligent. They were making the only choice available to them. But that choice had a cost. A physical, measurable, visible cost, in the bodies of the children. Then there is the psychological impact. Human beings are not built for confinement. We need space. We need variety. We need the stimulation of a changing environment. We need the horizon. We need to be able to look up and see the sky. Remove those things and the mind begins to do strange things. The first effect, in most studies of extended confinement, is disruption of time perception. Without the cycling of day and night, without the external cues that tell us how much time is passing, we lose track. Days begin to blur. The sense of duration, of knowing that it has been 3 weeks or 3 months, becomes unreliable. This loss of time perception is profoundly disorienting. We are temporal creatures. We navigate our lives through time. We plan, we remember, we anticipate. Remove reliable time perception, and you remove a fundamental scaffolding of the self. What comes next, in prolonged confinement, is cognitive change. Attention narrows. The ability to think about abstract, distant things diminishes. The mind focuses on the immediate, the next meal, the next sleep, the next small discomfort. This narrowing has survival value in the short term. In the long term, it erodes the capacity for the kind of complex planning and social cooperation that a community like Derinkuyu required to function. Then there is the darkness itself. The human brain, deprived of visual input, does not simply go quiet. It generates its own. In conditions of extreme darkness, the visual cortex, starved of the input it evolved to process, begins to produce spontaneous images. Phosphenes, the spots and patterns you see when you press your eyes closed. At greater extremes, more complex visual phenomena. Shapes, figures, light sources that are not there. In the context of an enclosed, echoing underground space, with the sound of 20,000 people moving and breathing and speaking, with the constant drip of water and the crack of cooling rock, with the smell of smoke and animals, the conditions for perceptual distortion are profound. What did the people of Derinkuyu see in the dark, in the small hours of their underground night? We do not know. We can only imagine. But it would be remarkable if, over months or years of underground living, the incidence of what we would today call hallucination, visual, auditory, olfactory, was not significant. This has implications for religious experience, for the development of mythology, for the kinds of stories a community tells itself about what exists in the darkness, about what is listening in the stone, and perhaps, eventually, for the question of what the people of Derinkuyu believed they were hiding from. Modern researchers studying the long-term effects of cave dwelling and extreme isolation have identified a cluster of symptoms they have informally called cave syndrome. These include persistent disorientation, anxiety in open spaces, hypersensitivity to light, difficulty sleeping in normal day-night cycles, social withdrawal, emotional blunting, and, critically, a phenomenon that is almost the opposite of what you might expect: difficulty readjusting to life on the surface. People who have spent extended periods underground do not simply emerge and pick up where they left off. The surface world, which was once normal, has become alien. Too bright, too loud, too open, too changeable. The fixed temperature of the underground, the predictable dimness, the enclosed spaces that once felt suffocating, now feel familiar and safe. For the people of Derinkuyu who were underground for months, this would have been a real phenomenon. The return to the surface world, assuming the return was eventually possible, would not have been the simple liberation it might appear. It would have been, for many, a disorienting and distressing process of readaptation. And for those who went underground as children who had no strong memories of the surface to return to, for those children, the surface world they emerged into was not a homecoming. It was a foreign country. Let me talk about something that is rarely discussed in the standard coverage of Derinkuyu. What happened to the social fabric of a community living underground? 20,000 people. In an enclosed space. For months. Possibly years. These are not ideal conditions for social harmony. The research we have on extended confinement in group settings, from military units to research stations to long-term imprisonment, consistently shows that interpersonal conflict escalates significantly under conditions of prolonged confinement. Minor irritations become major grievances. Personality clashes that would be manageable in an open setting become intractable in a confined one. The small physical space amplifies every social tension. Who was in charge at Derinkuyu? We don't know with certainty, but the structure of the city suggests clear hierarchical organization. Larger, better positioned spaces for leaders or religious figures, smaller spaces for ordinary families. A community of 20,000 does not organize itself spontaneously. There were leaders. There were rules. There was authority. But maintaining authority, maintaining social order, preventing the kind of breakdown that could destroy a community from within, under those conditions for those durations, would have required extraordinary social discipline and cultural cohesion. The fact that Derinkuyu was used repeatedly over centuries suggests that that discipline was maintained. That the communities which used it were capable of the remarkable psychological feat of remaining functional, remaining cooperative, remaining humane, through conditions that modern psychological research suggests would be severely destabilizing. Oh, what was the cultural glue that held them together? Almost certainly religion. The chapels at Derinkuyu, the rooms converted to sacred use, were not peripheral features of the underground city. They were central. They were, perhaps, the most important rooms in the entire complex. Because in a situation of extreme uncertainty, extreme confinement, extreme fear, religion provides something that no engineering can: meaning. a framework for suffering, a reason to endure. The people of Derinkuyu prayed in the dark. They held services in rock-cut chambers. They maintained whatever rituals connected them to something larger than their immediate survival. That is not superstition. That is wisdom. Accumulated, hard-won generational wisdom about what humans need in order to remain human under inhuman conditions. We have been circling this question from the beginning, and now we are going to face it directly. What were they hiding from? The conventional answer, the one you will find in most texts, designed against armies. An army does not try to come through a tunnel one person at a time. An army lays siege. An army blockades. An army cuts off food and water and waits. The ventilation system protects against blockade, fresh air independent of the surface. The water system protects against blockade, aquifer access independent of surface water. The food storage protects against blockade, enough grain and wine stored underground for an extended occupation. Derinkuyu was designed to resist a siege of extraordinary duration. Not just a few days or a few weeks but months, years. What army maintains a siege for years? And more fundamentally, why build 18 levels? Why go 280 feet deep? An army that has surrounded your position cannot reach you at depth 3 of a city that extends to depth 18. Once you are inside 200 feet down, no invasion force is going to dig you out. The depth is not about military threat. The depth is about something else. Some historians and archaeologists have proposed that one of the primary threats Derinkuyu was designed to address was not military but biological. Disease. Epidemic. Plague. Consider the timeline. The Justinianic plague of the 6th century AD, the first great pandemic of the bubonic plague, swept through the Byzantine Empire and Anatolia with devastating effect. Estimates suggest it killed between 25 and 50 million people in the Byzantine sphere over several decades. Cappadocia was not exempt. Before that, there were the Antonine Plague and the Plague of Cyprian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, pandemic events that together killed tens of millions across the Roman Empire, including its Anatolian provinces. Before that, possibly much further back, there were disease events we cannot name because the historical record is too sparse, but whose demographic impact we can infer from the archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements, collapsed civilizations, population crashes. Could Derinkuyu have been used as a quarantine facility? Could the sealed levels, those sections of the city that could be isolated from the rest by rolling stone doors, have been used to contain infected individuals while the healthy community continued to function in the other levels? The physical architecture would support this use. The water isolation system, each level's water supply independent of the others, would have been valuable in exactly this scenario. The ability to seal a level and continue using the ventilation shafts above and below it would have been critical. But there is a third theory. One that has gained significant traction in recent years as our understanding of ancient climate catastrophe has deepened. What if the threat was not military and not biological but environmental? What if the people of Derinkuyu were hiding from the sky itself? This sounds dramatic. It is dramatic. But the evidence for periodic catastrophic climate events in the ancient Near East is now substantial and growing. In the year 536 AD, something happened that caused a mysterious fog to appear over Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia that persisted for 18 months. Temperatures dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius across the northern hemisphere. Summer temperatures in Europe fell to some of the lowest ever recorded. Snow fell in China during the summer months. Drought and famine spread across multiple continents. 536 AD is now considered by some climate scientists and historians to have been the worst year to be alive in all of recorded history. The famine that followed the agricultural failure killed tens of millions. The weakening of populations by starvation set the stage for the Justinianic plague a few years later, which killed tens of millions more. What caused the fog of 536? The leading theory is a massive volcanic eruption, possibly from Iceland, that injected sufficient quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere to reflect enough sunlight to trigger a mini ice age. The evidence for this in ice core records is unambiguous. But 536 was not unique. It was not even, in geological terms, particularly extreme. In approximately 1628 BC, well within the period when Derinkuyu may have been in significant use, a volcano erupted on the Greek island of Thera. You may know it today as Santorini. The Thera eruption is estimated to have been the largest volcanic event in human history during the last 4,000 years. 4 times more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883. So powerful that it effectively destroyed the Minoan civilization of Crete, contributing to the collapse of one of the most sophisticated cultures of the Bronze Age. The eruption would have been audible across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The ash it produced would have fallen across Turkey, Egypt, and the Levant. The tsunami it generated would have swept the coastlines for hundreds of miles. And the climate effect, the injection of volcanic gases into the stratosphere, the dimming of the sun, the cooling of temperatures, the failure of harvests, would have been felt for years, possibly decades. In central Anatolia, in Cappadocia, the effects of the Thera eruption would have included cold summers, crop failures, reduced sunlight, increased precipitation, disruption of normal agricultural cycles. What do you do when the sun disappears behind volcanic ash? When the cold comes in the middle of summer and your crops fail? When the sky turns colors that have no name, and the world feels like it is ending? You go underground, where the temperature is constant, where the cold cannot reach you, where you have stored food and water, where the world above, however terrible, cannot touch you. Underground, where it is always 55 degrees, where the seasons do not exist. Let me give you a modern analogy that might make this more viscerally real. In April 1815, Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted. It remains the most powerful volcanic eruption in recorded human history. It killed at least 71,000 people directly. But its indirect effects were catastrophic on a global scale. 1816 became known as the year without summer. In Britain, June 1816 saw frosts and snow. In New England, temperatures fell below freezing in June. Crops failed across the northern hemisphere. Famine spread through Europe, Ireland, Wales, Switzerland, France, with death tolls that we still cannot fully calculate. The famine triggered social unrest, revolution, mass migration, and economic collapse across multiple countries. And this was in 1815 and 1816, with global trade networks, with relief systems, with governments and institutions and technologies designed to manage exactly this kind of crisis. Imagine the same event 3,000 years ago. Imagine the same climate catastrophe striking a Bronze Age society in Anatolia, a society entirely dependent on rain-fed agriculture, with no global trade network to fall back on, with no institutional framework for famine relief. A story of a catastrophic inundation, the world destroyed by water, a chosen few who survive, the eventual return to a changed world. The Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh contains one. The Hebrew Bible contains one. The Greek myths contain one, Deucalion and Pyrrha. Ancient Indian texts contain one. Accounts from Mesoamerica contain one. Accounts from cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans and continents, all contain some version of the same basic narrative. The world was destroyed, the water came, and a small number of survivors waited out the disaster and then emerged to rebuild. Some scholars believe these myths preserve cultural memory of real catastrophic events. The end of the last ice age, perhaps, when sea levels rose dramatically as the glaciers melted. Others see them as independently invented metaphors for civilizational collapse. But what if some of those myths, specifically the ones that come from the regions of Anatolia and the Near East, preserve not the memory of a flood but the memory of something else? The memory of a time when people went underground to survive a catastrophe that made the surface world uninhabitable? What if the myth of the flood, the sealed vessel, the waiting out of the catastrophe, the eventual emergence into a changed world, is the memory of the underground cities? What if Derinkuyu is not just an archaeological site, but a physical instantiation of the mythological memory of a period when the only salvation was to go below? I'm not saying this is what happened. I am saying, the architecture of Derinkuyu and the narrative structure of the flood myths are more similar than they first appear. Both describe a chosen group, sealed inside a protected space, surrounded by catastrophe, waiting. And eventually, carefully, tentatively, emerging. I mentioned earlier the tunnel that connects Derinkuyu to Cappadocia, the nearly 10-kilometer-long underground passage between the two cities. Let me give that detail the attention it deserves, because I believe it is one of the most significant and most underappreciated aspects of the entire Derinkuyu complex. 10 kilometers. Underground. Wide enough for a person, no wider. Carved through volcanic rock with hand tools, maintained for centuries, used as a covert transit route between two underground cities. The scale of this is difficult to overstate. Building Derinkuyu was an extraordinary feat of engineering. Building Cappadocia was an extraordinary feat of engineering. Building the tunnel between them, maintaining it, keeping it clear of falls, ensuring its ventilation, mapping and navigating it in darkness, was an additional, separate, extraordinary feat of engineering. Why go to that trouble? The obvious strategic answer is redundancy. If one city is discovered, if the enemy finds the entrances to Derinkuyu and manages to establish a presence inside, the tunnel provides an escape route to Cappadocia without ever surfacing. The population can evacuate one city and relocate to the other, entirely underground, entirely invisibly. That is a strategic masterstroke. It means that even a successful forced entry to one city does not trap its population. They have a way out that their attackers do not know about. But think about the implications more carefully. To need a 10-kilometer underground escape tunnel, you have to be facing a threat that is, first, present on the surface. The threat must be out there, above you, aware that you are somewhere in this area searching for you. Because if the threat is not on the surface, if you are simply trying to get from one city to the other, you would just walk. 10 kilometers above ground is a 2-hour walk. 10 kilometers underground, crouching through a narrow tunnel in darkness, is a very different undertaking. You only choose the underground route if the surface is too dangerous. Second, capable of sustained search. The tunnel is not useful for a brief raid that passes through. It is useful when the threat is going to be in the area for a long time, long enough that normal surface travel remains impossible for extended periods. Third, concentrated enough to be avoided by going underground. If the threat were uniformly distributed, if the air itself were dangerous or the climate, then the tunnel would not help. The tunnel assumes that the threat is located in specific places on the surface and can be avoided by going underneath those places. This profile matches a military threat very well. An army occupying the area, knowing there are people hiding somewhere in the volcanic landscape, methodically searching the surface, but unable to see the tunnel, unable to detect the underground passage, unable to follow the population as it moves from city to city beneath their feet. But it also has implications for the climate catastrophe theory. If the surface has become hostile, if it is too cold, too dark, too dangerous for agriculture and survival, then the tunnel allows the communities of two cities to pool their resources, to share food, to trade skills, to maintain contact and social cohesion even while separated by the dangerous surface world. In either scenario, the tunnel represents something profound, a refusal to be cut off, a determination to maintain connection, between communities, between people, even when everything above ground is conspiring to isolate them. And Derinkuyu and Cappadocia are not alone. The full network of underground cities and interconnecting tunnels in Cappadocia represents one of the largest and most complex underground human habitation systems ever built. Dozens of cities, hundreds of smaller complexes, thousands of individual rooms and passages, spread across hundreds of square miles of volcanic plateau. This was not the emergency measure of a single frightened community. This was a regional infrastructure project, a civilizational choice. The collective decision of an entire culture, possibly over many generations, possibly many different cultures building on each other's work, to maintain a parallel underground world as a permanent feature of life in this region. Derinkuyu is the largest and most impressive node in that network. But it should be understood as part of a whole, not as an isolated phenomenon. The whole says something different from any individual part. The whole says, the surface world in this region was, for extended periods, considered dangerous enough that an entire civilization invested its resources in building an alternative. Not an escape route. An alternative. A complete alternative way of life, Underground, with its own cities and its own infrastructure and its own social organizations and its own sacred spaces. That is not a response to occasional raiding. That is a response to something more fundamental. Something that made the surface itself, the open air, the sunlight, the sky, too dangerous to rely on. What was it? In the past few decades, a new tool has transformed our understanding of ancient catastrophes. Ice cores. Drilled from the glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica, specific years with extraordinary precision. And what those ice cores show is startling. The period from approximately 1200 BC to 700 BC, roughly the same period that historians associate with the Bronze Age collapse and its aftermath, shows elevated levels of volcanic aerosols, sulfur compounds and ash deposits. Multiple large volcanic events in this period, stacked on top of each other with climate effects that compound and amplify. The period from roughly 500 BC to 200 BC, another period of significant civilizational stress across the Mediterranean, shows similar signals. And the period around 536 AD and the following decades shows one of the clearest and most dramatic volcanic signals in the entire Holocene record, the event that caused the fog, the year without summer of the ancient world. Each of these periods corresponds, with remarkable consistency, to periods of known civilizational stress. Collapse of empires. Abandonment of cities. Mass migrations. Famine. Disease. The kinds of catastrophes that drive people underground. The ice cores are not proving that Derinkuyu was built for climate reasons. But they are showing that the periods when Derinkuyu was most intensively used were also periods of extraordinary climate and volcanic stress. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. Ice cores are not the only line of evidence. Lake sediment records from Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean tell a similar story. Lake Van in eastern Turkey. Lake Hazar. The Sea of Galilee. Each of these water bodies has accumulated layers of sediment over thousands of years, and each layer preserves a chemical and biological fingerprint of the conditions that prevailed when that layer was deposited. What those sediment records show is extended periods of drought, in some cases droughts lasting decades, punctuated by occasional episodes of intense rainfall and flooding. Oscillations between extremes. A climate that was, during these periods, not simply cooler or warmer but more volatile. Less predictable. More extreme in both directions. Volatile climate is, in some ways, more dangerous than consistently bad climate. If you know it is going to be dry every year, you can plan for that. You can build irrigation systems, select drought-resistant crops, develop storage strategies. But if you do not know whether this year will be a drought or a flood, whether the harvest will be a feast or a famine, if the fundamental predictability of the agricultural cycle, on which your entire civilization depends, has been undermined, then the uncertainty itself becomes the threat. And uncertainty of that magnitude, the uncertainty of not knowing whether the sky above will feed you or kill you this year, is exactly the kind of threat that might drive you underground. Not because underground is necessarily comfortable, but because underground, at least, the temperature is constant. The air is breathable. The water comes from the aquifer, which does not care whether there is drought or flood on the surface. Underground, you are insulated from the volatility of the sky. A third line of evidence comes from pollen analysis. Pollen is extraordinarily durable. Trapped in lake sediments, in cave deposits, in archaeological sites, pollen grains can persist for thousands of years with their species identities intact. By analyzing the pollen at a site, what plants were present in what proportions over what period, paleobotanists can reconstruct the vegetation history of a region with remarkable precision. The pollen record from Cappadocia and the surrounding region tells a story of dramatic vegetation change over the past 4,000 years. Forest retreat and expansion. Grassland expansion during periods of drought. The collapse of agricultural pollen markers, wheat, barley, grape, during periods of stress followed by recovery. But here is the detail that struck me when I first encountered it. There are periods in the pollen record of Cappadocia where agricultural pollen markers essentially disappear. Where the record, for decades at a time, shows no evidence of significant farming activity on the surface of the plateau. No farming on the surface. For decades. If there were no people farming on the surface, Where were the people? The pollen record, of course, does not preserve the presence of people underground. But the absence of agricultural activity on the surface, combined with the known existence of extensive underground habitation infrastructure, and the evidence of climate stress severe enough to make surface agriculture impossible, these three things point in the same direction. People went underground. They took their grain stores and their animals and their oil lamps. They closed the doors. And they waited while the surface world recovered. I want to spend some time on the darkness. Not the abstract darkness of historical narrative, but the specific physical sensory reality of what it was like to live at Derinkuyu. Your primary light source is an oil lamp. In the ancient world, this means a small clay vessel, sometimes no larger than your fist, holding olive oil or animal fat, with a wick of flax or twisted plant fiber. It produces a small, warm, slightly orange flame. In a good oil lamp of the ancient period, the flame is perhaps 3 or 4 centimeters tall. It flickers constantly, responding to the slightest movement of air. In a room of moderate size, say 4 meters by 5 meters, one oil lamp provides barely enough light to see the walls. Not to read. Not to work with fine materials. Barely enough to navigate the space without walking into things. 2 or 3 lamps make it comfortable for basic tasks. But fuel is finite, and every lamp you burn requires oil you have stored underground. The light at the edges of the room fades into shadow. The corners are dark. The ceiling above you, the rock ceiling, carved and rough, reflecting the lamplight unevenly, seems to press down. The walls feel close. When the lamp is extinguished, for sleep or to conserve fuel, or because the flame has simply guttered out in a draft, the darkness is total. Not the darkness of a room with curtains drawn, where your eyes eventually adjust and you can make out shapes. Not the darkness of a cloudy night, where there is still ambient light from the sky. Total. Absolute. The kind of darkness where you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. Where the visual cortex, deprived of all input, begins to generate its own images, the phosphine patterns of total deprivation. This was the darkness in which the children of Derinkuyu slept. Night after night. Week after week. Month after month. This was the darkness in which the old people sat when their lamps ran low and they chose to conserve fuel rather than waste it on light. This was the darkness that was always there at the edges. Always waiting. Always just beyond the pool of lamplight. And then there is the sound. Underground sound behaves differently from surface sound. Echo that can make it seem as if there are other footsteps, out of sync, following yours. Ghost footsteps. The sound of someone who is not there. Voices carry through rock in strange ways. You can hear, from 3 rooms away, a conversation that is being conducted at a normal speaking volume. But the distance and the rock distort the words, stripping out the high frequencies, leaving only the rumble and rhythm. You know someone is speaking. You cannot hear what they are saying. Water drips. Rock cracks. The thermal expansion and contraction of stone, almost inaudible in any individual event, adding up over hours to a constant background of microscopic sounds that the rock makes as it adjusts to the presence of bodies and lamps and breath. The acoustic environment of Derinkuyu was, by all accounts, deeply strange. And strangeness of that kind, unfamiliar sounds, misattributed sounds, sounds with no obvious source, is deeply unsettling for a human nervous system calibrated to interpret sound as information about threats. Every unexplained sound is, at some level, registered by the primitive brain as a potential danger. Every sound that cannot be immediately identified produces a tiny spike of cortisol, of alertness, of readiness. After weeks underground, those tiny spikes become exhausting. The nervous system cannot distinguish between the low moan of the ventilation shaft and the sound of something wrong. Cannot distinguish between the echo of your own footsteps and the sound of someone following you. This is not paranoia. This is the nervous system doing exactly what it evolved to do: interpret ambiguous sensory information in the most survival-relevant way possible. In the underground city, that adaptive system becomes maladaptive. It generates a background of low-level anxiety that never quite goes away. The darkness still remembers. The stone still echoes. And the people who lived in that echoing darkness carried it with them, even after they emerged. Let me add one more sensory dimension: Smell. 52 ventilation shafts notwithstanding, the air inside Derinkuyu, during periods of occupation, would have been far from clean. Every oil lamp produces combustion products, carbon monoxide, particulates, traces of various organic compounds. In a large, well-ventilated space, this is manageable. In an underground city with dozens or hundreds of lamps burning simultaneously, these combustion products accumulate. The air smells of smoke. The walls blacken with soot over time. The stables on the upper levels produce their own contribution to the air quality. Animal waste, animal breath, animal bodies. In warm conditions, these smells are powerful and pervasive. They travel through the tunnel system, mixing with the lamp smoke and the smell of cooking. Human bodies, unwashed over extended periods in a confined space without running water, without the ability to air out clothing or bedding, produce their own distinctive contribution. And beneath it all, the smell of rock. The particular, ancient, mineral smell of volcanic tuff that has been enclosed for centuries. The people of Derinkuyu lived with this smell. They breathed it. They ate while smelling it. They slept in it. After weeks, they would no longer have noticed it. The brain habituates to constant sensory inputs with extraordinary speed. But they were breathing it. Constantly. Day and night. And when they finally emerged, when those great stone doors were rolled back and the outside air poured in, that moment must have been extraordinary. Not just emotionally but physically. The shock of clean air, of the smell of earth and grass and sky, after months of underground miasma. I imagine it must have felt like resurrection. Survival in Derinkuyu required solving, on a large scale and for an extended duration, a problem that most of us never have to think about. How do you feed 20,000 people underground? The answer involves layers of planning that go far beyond simply stocking up on food before going below. The primary food stores at Derinkuyu were grain. Wheat and barley stored in large rock-cut chambers on the upper levels, where the temperature and humidity were most suitable for long-term preservation. Grain stored correctly, dry, cool, pest-free, can remain edible for years. The people of Derinkuyu had that storage capacity. Dried and fermented foods, preserved meats, dried fruits, fermented dairy products like cheese, would have supplemented the grain. The winery we discussed earlier produced wine, which has its own caloric value and which was, in the ancient world, a standard component of daily nutrition rather than a luxury beverage. But 20,000 people eating stored food for months creates a significant logistical challenge. Not just the volume of food required, but the management of its distribution, the prevention of spoilage, the maintenance of nutritional variety sufficient to prevent deficiency diseases. And then there is the problem of cooking. You cannot have 20,000 people each lighting their own cooking fire underground. The carbon monoxide accumulation would be lethal within hours. The smoke would make the air unbreathable. The evidence at Derinkuyu suggests communal cooking facilities, specific rooms designated for food preparation, with carefully managed ventilation, probably positioned near the main ventilation shafts to carry smoke out of the city as efficiently as possible. This implies communal organization of food production. Not every family cooking for itself, but shared cooking resources, collective preparation of meals, communal distribution. This has profound social implications. Communal cooking creates dependency and community. When you eat food prepared by others, when your survival literally depends on the collective management of the food supply, you are embedded in a web of mutual obligation and trust that is very difficult to dissolve. The food arrangements at Derinkuyu were not just logistical. They were social technology. They created bonds of interdependency that made the community more cohesive, more resilient, more capable of surviving the pressures of extended underground habitation. What did a child do at Derinkuyu during a long period of underground residence? This question is, in some ways, the most humanizing you can ask. Because a child cannot simply sit still and wait for the danger to pass. A child needs stimulation, needs movement, needs play, needs learning. A child who is kept still and quiet for months will not simply be bored, they will suffer developmental harm. The rooms we believe may have been used for education, the rooms that later became the missionary schools of the Christian period, suggest that the people of Derinkuyu understood this. That children needed to be doing something. learning something. What did they learn? In the pre-Christian period, probably the same things all ancient children learn, to maintain the continuity of their civilization. That is an extraordinary achievement of education, of intention, of the human determination to pass knowledge forward even under the most adverse conditions imaginable. There is another human reality that must be addressed. What happened when people fell ill at Derinkuyu? What happened to the old, the frail, the dying? We do not have direct evidence for medical practices at Derinkuyu, but we can make reasonable inferences from what we know of ancient Anatolian and later Cappadocian cultures. There would have been healers, people with knowledge of the medicinal plants of the region, and remember, those plants would have been part of the stored supplies, brought underground along with the grain and the oil. Ancient medicine in this region was sophisticated by the standards of the time, blending herbal knowledge with religious practice in ways that were, in many cases, genuinely effective. But for serious illness, the kind of illness that requires rest, isolation from others and specialized care, the underground environment was challenging. The sealed, enclosed nature of the city made true isolation difficult. The poor light made diagnosis hard. The limited water supply for washing and hygiene made post-surgical or post-illness recovery more difficult. And for the dying, those for whom no medicine, however skilled, could offer hope, Derinkuyu presented a particular challenge. Death underground. The body cannot remain inside. The air cannot absorb it. The rock can. Human effort and no space was wasted on comfort that was not strictly necessary. Visitors to Derinkuyu consistently report the same emotional experience. Not curiosity. Not historical wonder. Fear. Specifically, the slow, gathering, irrational but very real fear that the rock is going to close in, that the passages are going to narrow, that the way back is going to disappear. This is claustrophobia in its most primal form. And it is worth noting that modern visitors, people who know perfectly well that they are in a safe, professionally managed archaeological site with clearly marked exits, electric lighting and tour guides, feel this. Imagine feeling it in total darkness, with the knowledge that the exits were sealed, with the knowledge that outside, somewhere above you, was whatever you had come here to escape. The fear that tourists feel at Derinkuyu today is a pale shadow of what the people who lived here must have felt. But it is a real shadow. The rock remembers something. The space has a character. The darkness, even with electric lights, presses in a way that daylight does not. This is a place built by fear. You can feel it in the walls. Despite decades of archaeological investigation, Derinkuyu still holds secrets. The lowest accessible levels have been stabilized and opened. The levels below, those final few floors at the bottom of the shaft 280 feet down, are not fully investigated. Access is restricted. The engineering challenges of working at that depth are significant. What is down there? We do not fully know. There may be rooms not yet discovered. There may be artifacts still sealed in chambers that have not been opened in 2,000 years. There may be answers to the questions that archaeologists have been asking about Derinkuyu since the 1960s. And there are questions that the archaeology may never be able to answer. Why precisely was each particular level sealed with its rolling door? What event, or series of events, prompted the last full occupation of the city before it was finally abandoned? What was the population at its maximum? How were the decisions made about who came underground and who stayed above? Was there ever a person left on the surface, a sentinel, perhaps, whose job it was to monitor conditions and report back? And if so, how did they communicate? How did they pass messages through the rolling stone door to the people inside? We do not know. We may never know. And that not knowing is part of what makes Derinkuyu what it is. Not just an archaeological site but a mystery. A place that answered some questions and generated 100 more for every one it resolved. Let me tell you what I think Derinkuyu really is. It is a monument to fear. Not to victory. Not to conquest. Not to the triumph of civilization over nature or over enemies. Not to the ambition of kings or the power of gods. To fear. Ordinary, human, desperate, enduring fear. The people who built Derinkuyu were afraid. They were afraid of something so serious, so persistent, so utterly beyond their ability to fight or negotiate with, that they carved an entire city into the earth as their answer to it. They invested generations of collective labor, the labor of grandparents and parents and children and grandchildren, in building a place of last resort. That is what fear looks like when it is given enough time and enough collective will. It does not look like panic. It does not look like running. It looks like engineering. It looks like planning. It looks like rolling stone doors and ventilation shafts and isolated water supplies and schools and wineries. It looks like the most extraordinary construction project in the ancient world. There is a temptation when discussing places like Derinkuyu to treat them as pure historical curiosity, as evidence of how different the ancient world was, as proof that we have moved beyond the fears that drove those people underground. I want to resist that temptation, and I want to ask you to resist it too, because the forces that drove people into Derinkuyu are not historical forces. They are not gone. They have not been resolved. Climate catastrophe is not a historical phenomenon. Volcanic supereruptions happen on geological timescales that make human civilization look like a momentary flicker. The climate disruption that drove the Bronze Age collapse, drought, famine, the failure of agricultural systems, is not something that stopped being possible after 1200 BC. Epidemic disease is not a historical phenomenon. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 reminded the entire world, with brutal clarity, that epidemics capable of shutting down civilization, of forcing people into their homes, of closing borders, of disrupting supply chains and economic systems, are not things that only happened in the ancient world. Social collapse, the unraveling of the complex systems that allow large numbers of people to live together, to trade, to cooperate, to maintain peace, is not a historical phenomenon. The Bronze Age collapse happened. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. The Maya classical period ended. These were real events that happened to real civilizations that, from the inside, probably looked as stable and permanent as ours does to us. The people of Derinkuyu were not primitive. They were not limited by a failure of imagination or a lack of sophistication. They were not in some essential way different from us. They were us. They were humans, intelligent, social, creative, fearful, hopeful, loving, complicated humans, who faced a world that had become more dangerous than they could manage from the surface. And they responded with the best tool they had, collective intelligence. The accumulated wisdom of generations, encoded in the architecture of survival, carved into the stone of the Cappadocian plateau. They did not give up. They did not simply accept that the world was ending and wait to die. They built. They planned. They prepared. They went underground and they kept their children alive and they maintained their culture and their faith and their knowledge and they waited. And when it was finally safe, when the threat above had passed whatever form it had taken, they came back. They came up out of the dark, back into the sunlight, back to the surface of the world they had temporarily abandoned. And they started again. I have visited Derinkuyu. I have stood in those low carved rooms, 80 feet below the plateau surface, surrounded by rock that has not changed since people last lived here. I have placed my hand on the wall and felt the tool marks, the chisel strokes of a person who died perhaps 2,000 years ago or perhaps 4,000 years ago, we cannot say with certainty. And I have thought about what it was like to be that person. To swing that chisel day after day, in a chamber lit by a small clay lamp, carving out room for people you loved to survive in. You did not know if the threat above would ever end. You did not know if the city you were building would ever be needed or needed again or how long it would be needed for. You did not know if your children would ever emerge into daylight from the place you were building to hide them. But you swung the chisel, day after day. Because the alternative, not building, not preparing, not having this place when the darkness came, was unthinkable. That is love expressed as engineering. That is hope carved in stone. That is the most human thing I have ever seen. Let me bring together everything we have discussed and offer what I think is the most honest and complete answer to the question of why Derinkuyu was built. The honest answer is, not for one reason and not at one time. Derinkuyu was not built as a response to a single threat. It was built and used and expanded and returned to over a period of perhaps 3,000 years by multiple different peoples, in response to multiple different threats. The Hittites may have begun it, or significantly expanded an even earlier construction, as a refuge against the raiding peoples on their northern and eastern borders. For them, it was primarily a military facility, a place to go when the armies came. The Bronze Age collapse, around 1200 BC, may have driven the most desperate and sustained occupation, not just by armies but by the chaos of civilizational breakdown. Famine, refugee flows, the collapse of trade, the disintegration of every protective structure that civilization provides. For the survivors of that collapse, Derinkuyu was a survival bunker for a period when the surface world had essentially ceased to be viable. The early Christians used it as a refuge from persecution, a very different kind of threat, targeted and specifically religious, but no less existential for those facing it. Later communities used it during the Arab raids, the Mongol incursions, the periods of military and political instability that characterized the medieval history of Anatolia. And beneath all of these specific historical threats, there may be the oldest layer of all, the climate memory. The memory of the times when the sky turned dark and the crops failed and the temperature dropped and there was nothing to be done on the surface except starve. The memory that drove the original builders to carve those deepest, most inaccessible levels. The levels where the temperature never changes, where the aquifer runs clean and deep, where even the most catastrophic surface event cannot reach you. Derinkuyu is the product of all of these threats and all of these times. It is a palimpsest of human fear and human resilience, written in stone by a succession of peoples who all came to the same conclusion. Sometimes the only answer is to go deeper. But I said at the beginning that I would be honest with you. And honesty requires me to acknowledge that there is something about Derinkuyu that we still cannot fully explain. The depth. Why 18 levels? Why 280 feet? For military purposes, the top 3 or 4 levels would have been more than sufficient. No army is going to dig you out from 150 feet down, let alone 280. The engineering and labor required to go from level 4 to level 18 represents an enormous investment for marginal additional military security. For climate refuge, there is a point, perhaps 50 or 60 feet down, where the temperature becomes constant and the surface conditions are genuinely irrelevant. You do not need to be 280 feet deep to escape the cold of a volcanic winter. For disease quarantine, a few levels of sealed chambers would have been adequate. So why 18? Why go so deep? What is down there at level 18 that is not adequately provided at level 10? The honest answer is, we do not know. There are theories. There are speculations. Some researchers have suggested that the deepest levels were never intended for human habitation at all, that they were specifically for storage of the most precious resources, the things that absolutely could not be allowed to be destroyed or taken. Seed grain, perhaps, essential for any post-catastrophe agricultural revival. Sacred objects. Archives. Some have suggested that the deep levels were built for reasons we have not yet identified, that there is a threat model we have not yet reconstructed, for which the depth was genuinely necessary. Some have gone further, into territory that mainstream archaeology regards as speculative but that I find, given everything else about this site, worth at least acknowledging, and suggested that the builders of the deepest levels knew something we do not. That they had information, passed down through generations of accumulated observation, about catastrophic events that require deeper refuge than any military threat would demand. I cannot tell you which of these is correct. I can tell you that the depth of Derinkuyu is one of the things about it that keeps me awake. Because the people who carved those deepest levels were not doing it for fun. They were not carving an extra dozen levels of underground city because they had nothing better to do. They had a reason. We just have not found it yet. Let me end where we began. With a door. Those rolling stone doors at Derinkuyu, those massive, circular, 1,000-pound slabs of volcanic tuff, engineered to be immovable from outside, designed to seal each level of the city from the next, are still there. You can see them today. Some are still in the channels carved for them. Some have been moved aside for tourists to pass through. If you visit Derinkuyu, you can touch them. You can put your hands on the same surface that the people of this city put their hands on when they rolled those doors into place. You can feel the smoothness of the rock where generations of hands wore it smooth. You can see the hole at the center, the hole through which a wooden beam was passed to lock the door from inside. And if you stand in a doorway at Derinkuyu and look at that hole, and think about the hands that last passed a beam through it, and the moment when that beam was slid home and the people on the inside knew they were sealed in for however long it would take for the world above to become safe again, you will understand something that no textbook can tell you. You will understand what it means to be human in the face of something that cannot be overcome. Not defeated. Not argued with. Not negotiated. Not escaped. Just endured. The people of Derinkuyu went underground and they waited. In darkness that was relieved only by small clay lamps. In air that smelled of smoke and animals and stone. In the perpetual 55-degree cold that never varied regardless of what the season was doing 300 feet above them. They waited while their children grew up without sunlight. While their elderly grew weaker in the dark. While their animals breathed recycled air in carved rock stalls. While their grain stores diminished day by day and they wondered, each day, whether today was the day it would be safe to open the doors. They waited while the ventilation shafts drew the cold air of the plateau down into the deep levels and the warm exhaled air of 20,000 people rose back toward the sky. They waited while the rolling stone doors held whatever was outside at bay. While the aquifer ran clean and cold beneath them, indifferent to the chaos above. They waited, and they sang to their children, and they told their stories, and they prayed in their rock-cut chapels, and they taught their lessons, and they made their wine, and they cared for their animals, and they lived. In the dark. Underground. Waiting for the world above to stop being what it was. And eventually, always eventually, the doors opened. Someone rolled back the stone. Someone climbed the stairs, crouching through the low passages, past the stables, past the storage rooms, up through the levels. Someone emerged from the darkness into the light. And felt the sun. After months, after years, after however long it had been, the sun. The temperature changed from that constant 55 degrees to the warmth of the Anatolian sun must have been physically overwhelming. The light, even on a cloudy day, must have been blinding after the perpetual dimness of the lamps. The smell of the air, clean and cold and real, after months of smoke and animals and confined humanity. The sky. Enormous and blue and incomprehensibly vast after the rock ceiling, never more than a few meters above your head for all those months. And the world. Whatever the world had become in their absence. Changed perhaps. Scarred perhaps. Quieter, with fewer people, with abandoned fields and collapsed houses. Or perhaps, in the best outcomes, largely intact, the threat having passed without the total destruction that had been feared. They came out. They looked at the world. They assessed. And they started again. The people who built and used Derinkuyu could not have known that their work would last. They could not have known that 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years later, a man would knock down a basement wall and find their city. They could not have known that the tool marks in their walls would still be legible, that their ventilation shafts would still be functional, that the hole in the stone door through which the locking beam was passed would still be visible to human eyes. They could not have known they were leaving a message. But they were. The message of Derinkuyu is not complex. It does not require deciphering. It is not in code. It is written in stone in the clearest possible language. Engineering. The message says we were here. We were afraid. We built something that could survive our fear. We survived. And the deeper message, the one in the 18 levels and the 280 feet of depth and the rolling stone doors and the ventilation shafts that still work today, is this: we did not know what was coming. We did not know how bad it would be or how long it would last. We did not know if the people who came after us would be our own children or strangers who found our empty city centuries later. We built for all of those possibilities. We built for permanence. We built for the worst case. We built as if the world might end and then begin again, and we wanted to make sure that somewhere, in the deep rock, there was a place that could hold a community through that ending and out the other side. Derinkuyu is still there. The doors are still in their channels. The ventilation shafts still work. The rolling stone slabs can still be moved. The water channels still reach the aquifer. After all this time, after everything that has happened above it, all the empires and the collapses and the civilizations and the catastrophes, Derinkuyu is still there. Still ready. Still waiting. The question that Derinkuyu asks us in the end is not a historical one. It is not a question about Bronze Age engineering or early Christian persecution or ancient climate science. It is a question about right now. What are you building? What have you prepared? What is your plan for the worst case? The people who carved those walls with chisel and pick, who designed those ventilation shafts, who rolled those stone doors into their channels and stood in the dark waiting. Those people had a plan. They looked at the world and they said, this could get very bad. We don't know exactly how bad. We don't know exactly when. But we are going to be ready. And they were. Are you? Those doors at Derinkuyu are still there. They have not been sealed in a very long time. For now they stand open, rolled back against the walls of their passages, the holes at their centers admitting the light from the electric lighting that guides the tourists who walk through them, touching the smooth stone with hands that would not have been out of place in the community that last locked them. But they could be rolled closed. They are waiting. Not urgently. Not impatiently. But waiting in the way that stone waits, which is to say, indefinitely. The world above Derinkuyu is today a peaceful farming plateau with an extraordinary tourist industry and a remarkable geological landscape. The fairy chimneys rise in the morning sun. The air smells of earth and herbs and the warmth of the Anatolian summer. Nothing is threatening the surface today. But Derinkuyu does not know that. Derinkuyu does not care. Derinkuyu was not built for today. It was built for the day that today is not. It was built for the day when the sky changes and the crops fail and the armies come and the world becomes a thing that cannot be lived in. It was built for the day that we hope never comes. And that, deep in the part of our brains that we do not talk about in polite company, we fear may come anyway. The darkness of Derinkuyu remembers every family that sheltered in it. Every child who was born into its lamplight. Every old person who died in its stone-carved rooms. Every prayer that was whispered in its rock chapels. Every decision that was made in its depths about whether today, finally, it was safe to open the doors. The darkness remembers. And it waits. Because stone is patient. And whatever comes next, whatever it is that the sky has in store for the civilizations that currently live on its surface, the stone will be here. The ventilation shafts will still work. The aquifer will still run. And somewhere at the bottom of a shaft that goes 280 feet into the earth, in a temperature that never changes, the rolling stone doors will be in their channels, ready to be rolled. Waiting for whoever needs them next. Before we end, I want to tell you something that most treatments of Derinkuyu omit, because it complicates the story, and complicated stories are sometimes harder to tell. Derinkuyu is not unique. Not in the way of being the only underground city. We have established that the Cappadocia network includes hundreds of underground settlements. But in the broader sense of, this kind of construction, this kind of response to this kind of threat, is not limited to one region or one culture or one period. Underground cities, of varying scales and levels of sophistication, have been found on every populated continent on Earth. In the American Southwest, the ancient Pueblo peoples of the Anasazi culture built cliff dwellings and underground chambers and canyon walls. In the Negev Desert of Israel, there are ancient underground complexes that predate the Roman period. In the Cappadocian region, as we have discussed. In China, ancient underground cities and tunnel networks. In Scotland, the souterrains, underground stone-lined passages associated with Iron Age settlements, are found across the landscape. In France and elsewhere in Europe, the souterrains represent a similar tradition of underground refuge during periods of threat. The underground impulse, the human response to overwhelming surface threat that says go deeper, go further, go below, is not culturally specific. It is not geologically specific. It appears independently in multiple cultures that had no contact with each other. That universality suggests something important. It suggests that the threats that drove people underground are not culturally specific either. Climate catastrophe is not a Cappadocian threat. It is a global threat. Epidemic disease is not an Anatolian phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon. Military threat, civilizational collapse, the failure of the social and environmental systems that support surface life, these are not things that happened only to the people who built Derinkuyu. They are things that happen to civilizations. All civilizations, including ours. The people who built the underground cities of the world were not weaker than us. They were not less sophisticated. They were not more superstitious or more easily frightened. They were people facing the world with the tools they had. They built. They went deep. They waited. They survived. And their empty cities are still there, scattered across the surface of the earth, waiting. A reminder. A warning. A monument to the one universal truth of human history: the world is not always safe. And sometimes the only answer is to go deeper.